2 weeks ago, I was asked to help with food distribution with the Maryland Food Bank. That morning, as volunteers were gathering and we were all putting on the appropriate personal protective gear that we brought with us, a woman named Wilma called us all together, and she began telling us that she had this really important unofficial announcement to make. As we gave her our attention, she told us that it was important for all of our voices to be heard in this election, so she encouraged us to vote. She said early voting was open, and there was a polling place right down the block. She continued going, "It's a good polling place. They give you water. And I only had to wait 3.5 hours yesterday, which really isn't too bad. So if you haven't, go and vote today." We all looked at her and nodded. But in my head, I was thinking, 3.5 hours is a really long time to wait. A moment later, another volunteer came running up and began asking all of us, "What do we do? We are all out of tickets for today, and we don't open for another hour and a half. We've given away all 124 tickets." The director immediately turned to them and said in a voice in a way that sounds like she's said this 1,000 times, "Start telling people they'll have to wait or to come back at the end to see if we have leftovers." So we did. And at the end of the shift, there weren't any leftovers. As we cleaned up the parking lot, I found myself reflecting on my own sense of privilege. I've never had to wait 3 hours to vote or worry about waiting in line for a ticket to get food. These last few years, I have been working intentionally on becoming more aware of the privilege I carry, particularly of my white privilege. Moments like these at the food bank are heavy reminders of how I benefit from a system that was set up to help a few people who look like me and oppress and disenfranchise countless more of God's beloved children. Our text this morning also involves deep hunger, a drought, and increasing division in an already divided kingdom. As we look at this story, it's important for us to know that the town of Zarephath is part of the northern kingdom of Israel. Several hundred years earlier, the kingdom of Israel divided into two over irreconcilable circumstances. They became known as the northern and the southern kingdoms. Separate empires, separate governments, and a divided people. The northern kingdom, which we are talking about today, is the place where the god of Baal is worshipped. And Elijah, who is a prophet, is headed there to convince the king and his wife Jezebel, as well as all the people of the northern kingdom, that God is the divine force in the world, not Baal. We'll see in a couple chapters later that only God can summon forth rain on command, not a golden idol. And it's important for us to realize that this widow is the very first person that Elijah meets in this northern country. This woman who is not even dignified with a name, only a title. She isn't important enough for the author to give her a name. Her title, however, does give us a little information about her life. It tells us that she is someone in her community who probably has little power or little privilege. This is because of how generational wealth was accumulated. Many ancient communities used a patriarchal system. This means that all the land and wealth is passed through a male lineage. So after her husband died, a widow couldn't inherit her husband's wealth, land, or livestock. Rather, it would be her sons, if she had any of age, or other male relatives. So with this knowledge, we can infer that due to the loss of her provider and husband, this woman and her young son were most likely struggling, even before the drought. It is also worth noting in this story that in Hebrew culture, it's expected that whenever a stranger, especially when it was a man, walks into your home, it is a faithful response to drop everything and provide hospitality and care. So God knew this woman's life and her struggles, and also knew what would be expected of her if a man were to show up on her front porch. And yet, God is still commanding this woman to care for Elijah. Not only that, but God went as far as to have a conversation with Elijah about this divine provision. But God never spoke to the widow or tried to give her a heads up. Rather, Elijah simply shows up at her house, expecting to be cared and provided for, just like any other male traveler. Meanwhile, this woman is collecting enough sticks to prepare a last meal for her and her son. This woman is on the brink of death, living in a society that does not care for her the way it should. There is no equality, equity, justice, or inclusion for this woman. And yet God has ordered her to provide and care for this strange man with more privilege and recognition in society than she might ever have. She even tries to turn Elijah away by telling him her story. And rather than having compassion, Elijah tells her to bring him food too. So she does. She was cornered into giving him what she had, even when she told him she barely had enough for her and her son. And I know that while God made sure she had enough to survive with a small bit of meal being replaced in a jar, this woman still had to step up and carry the weight of her family plus one. She still had to wake up with the anxiety every day of wondering if there would be more meal in this jar, or how long would it last. This work was saddled on her shoulders. And Elijah didn't help. He simply made promises that he was both expecting and hoping that the Lord would keep. This week, as I read the story about Elijah and this widow, I found myself thinking about the countless women Black organizers who have been working relentlessly for years and years to help fight voter suppression in the United States. I thought of women like Tamika Atkins, Helen Butler, Deborah Scott, and Stacey Abrams. No matter who you voted for, these women and so many others, including many Indigenous and Latinx organizers, have worked tirelessly so that more voices could be heard than ever before in an election. And at the same time, while those women were fighting and working hard, I found myself acting like Elijah. When I voted, I showed up to the ballot box on a pre-election day. I did not have to question whether my vote would be counted. Rather, I had confidence that my voice would be heard. I also didn't have to wait in a line. In fact, my ballot was mailed to my house, and my partner Eric and I were able to drop it off safely and easily at one of the 13 ballot drop-off locations in my tiny county. Our voting system is set up so that voices like mine could be heard. And the truth is, I didn't question it. I didn't check on my neighbors who might struggle to get to the polls. I didn't check and see if anyone needed support or help. I simply expected the system to work for me, because it does. And then, like so many of us, I had the opportunity to give thanks and celebrate the incredible amounts of folks who voted this year. reaping the benefit of other people's hard work. This is privilege. Voting easily is a privilege many of us hold, and many more do not. And those who benefit from it, we often aren't even aware of it. This system is violent and filled with pain, and it is full of sin. It hurts God's children and encourages us to push ourselves away from realities in this world that are not like ours, just like Elijah and this widow. Beloveds, much like the widow in this text, so often the work of justice, equity, and inclusion falls on the backs of those who are the most disenfranchised by society. People who are trying to survive, who live on the edge of life and death. They are the ones who show up carrying the load. And those of us who have privilege show up late, and we expect to be welcomed, received, and cared for, like it is our God-ordained mission. Myself included. So let me be loving enough to speak truth here. This is not the divine design for the beloved community. Y'all, there is still so much work to do, especially for those of us holding privilege. On Tuesday morning, professor, author, and activist Ibram Kendi tweeted about this election. I worry no matter what happens. If Trump wins, I worry some will blame the victims of voter suppression rather than voter suppression itself. If Biden wins, I worry some will act like this nation is post-racial, as so many did in 2008. Kendi speaks deep truth with these statements. We have seen time and time again that racism exists in this country and in this world. The election of a Black president did not erase racism or white supremacy in this country, nor will this one. Kendi reminds us that no matter who sits in the Oval Office, there will be work to do. We will have to hold our president and legislators accountable to their promises. There is still a hunger for justice. There are still folks whose human rights hang in the balance of a Supreme Court decision. There are still thousands of families who have been separated. And the numbers of COVID cases continues to rise as folks struggle to find jobs or afford rent and food. The election of a president is not the end of the work. It is merely a point in the journey. At the end of a long election season, it can be so easy for those of us with privilege to become complacent, to feel as if we deserve a job well done. However, the truth is, while many of us are enjoying the fruits of others' hard work and labor, while we celebrate this election season coming to a close, we cannot lose sight that God's kingdom is not here on earth yet. So our work cannot be done. Those of us who carry privilege must understand this, because this is a reality that so many of God's beloved children live in every day. The story of Elijah and the widow is also a reminder that God is not done with us yet. So we can't give up on ourselves either. While injustice and rudeness and the privilege that Elijah carries and the society holds is blatant in this story, we also know that this is only the beginning of Elisha's journey. Elijah will continue to grow and change and listen to God and to speak prophetic words about who God is in the world. He will continue to try, and he will carry his privilege, and he will make a lot of mistakes. But Elijah keeps going, and God keeps working on his heart so that it looks closer and closer to God's. Friends, we too must keep going, keep working, keep proclaiming truth about love, justice, mercy, and grace, even when that means proclaiming it to ourselves. Just because a tide is turning does not mean it will continue to do so without help. God has provided the meal, just like he did for that widow, but someone has to cook it and had to love people enough to make it. The meal didn't feed everyone. People still starved to death in that drought. The tide may have turned for the widow and her son and Elijah, but it did not fix the system. A little bit of meal, one administration change, does not bring about God's kingdom. Only God can do that. And we are called by God to be part of that work. So, beloveds, God is not done yet, so we can't be done either. God is not done loving you or speaking truth to you. So keep growing, keep being tender, and keep letting God change your heart to look more like God's. Listen to the truth and stories and the lives of those whose experiences are different than yours, because their story is God's story too. Beloveds, keep the faith. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Amen.